smiled gently. The apology opens the door. The life that follows determines whether anyone walks through it. Tamber let out a slow breath. I've never thought about it like that. I don't know if it's true. It's simply what I've observed. She looked at him curiously. Can I ask you something now? Of course. Are you married? For the first time that afternoon, Nolan hesitated. His eyes drifted toward the darkening horizon. Yes. His answer came quietly. I am. She waited. I have 2 children. She smiled. How old? A son who's nearly finished college, and a daughter who insists she's already wiser than I am. Tamber laughed. Is she? Frequently. There was affection in his voice. Real affection. Then it faded. I feel sorry for my wife sometimes. The admission surprised even him. Tamber tilted her head. Why? He looked out through the windscreen rather than at her. Because I spent too many years believing that providing was the same as being present. I convinced myself that working harder was another language for loving harder. He shook his head gently. It wasn't. I missed ordinary moments. I justified absences. I carried burdens I believed would protect my family. Without noticing that the burden itself had become another wall. He smiled sadly. I spoke to you about trust. The truth is, I've violated it in quieter ways than theft. I've broken promises simply by not becoming the husband I intended to be. Tamber studied him. That's an unusual thing to admit. It becomes less unusual with age. He walked around the rear passenger door and opened it. I almost forgot. He reached inside and produced a paper bag. I bought this at the last town. From it, he lifted a large sandwich wrapped neatly in paper, untouched. He held it up with an apologetic smile. I appear to have accidentally purchased enough food for two. You've been standing here nearly as long as I have. Would you help me avoid wasting it? She smiled. I don't know. He raised an eyebrow. A married woman probably shouldn't be accepting sandwiches from married men. He laughed quietly. I assure you, this sandwich has no scandalous intentions. She laughed. Besides, he continued with a self-deprecating smile. If my greatest talent today is getting lost on the back roads and breaking rental cars, I doubt I'm in any position to corrupt anyone. She couldn't help herself. She laughed again. That's a fair point. There's coffee, too. He reached back into the car and held up a stainless steel flask. Equally innocent. She looked at the growing darkness around them. All right. But the doors stay open. I wouldn't have suggested otherwise. A minute later, they sat inside the sedan, both doors wide open to the evening air. Tamber settled into the driver's seat, while Nolan occupied the passenger side. The prairie stretched before them like an endless sea beneath the first emerging stars. He poured coffee into two small metal cups. Steam curled lazily into the cooling air. They shared the sandwich in companionable silence for several moments before Nolan spoke again. When was the last time, he asked gently, that you felt truly close to your husband? Tamber looked down into the coffee, warming her hand. The answer came to her immediately. She simply wasn't sure she was ready to say it aloud. Tamber wrapped both hands around the warm metal cup. The coffee carried the rich scent of roasted beans and cedar smoke, somehow more comforting than anything that had happened all day. Outside, the evening stretched across the prairie without hurry. The open doors welcomed the cooling breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote announced the coming night. She watched the steam rise. I know the answer. Nolan remained still. I also know why you're hesitating. She smiled faintly. Because once I say it. She looked down at the coffee. I'll hear it. He nodded. Sometimes hearing our own words is the first time we realize we've been telling ourselves a story that no longer fits. She drew a slow breath. I honestly don't know when the last time was. It wasn't one day. It wasn't one argument. It was. She searched for the thought, like watching daylight disappear. You never actually see darkness arrive. You simply notice one evening that you can no longer read without turning on a light. She looked out over the endless grassland. Our marriage feels like that. I couldn't tell you which conversation changed us. I couldn't tell you which disappointment stayed too long. I couldn't even tell you which apology came too late. I just woke up one morning and realized. She swallowed. I missed someone who was sleeping beside me. Neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was respectful. Nolan broke a small piece from the sandwich before speaking. When you first met him, what did you admire? The question caught her off guard. She chuckled quietly. Nobody has asked me that in years. What was his name? She glanced at him curiously. His name is Ethan. She smiled to herself. He could make anybody laugh. He was fearless. The kind of man who could walk into a room where nobody knew him and leave with 10 new friends. She shook her head. I used to envy that. You aren't like that. Oh goodness, no. I've always preferred dogs. He smiled. They generally have simpler expectations. They rarely do. She laughed. If a dog loves you, you'll know. If a dog is angry with you, you'll definitely know. They don't spend 6 months pretending everything's fine. Nolan chuckled softly. There is wisdom in uncomplicated creatures. She nodded. There is. She looked through the windscreen. I think that's why I stayed in veterinary medicine. Animals never manipulate affection. They don't withhold it to make a point. They don't become cold because they lost an argument 3 weeks ago. If they are frightened, they are frightened. If they trust you, they trust you. She sighed. I sometimes wish people were allowed the same honesty. Nolan leaned back slightly. Tell me, what happened after the business began succeeding? She smiled, though it carried more sadness than happiness. Success changed everything. In the beginning, Ethan came home excited. He'd tell me every sale, every customer, every idea. I used to sit on the kitchen counter eating cereal at midnight while he talked. I barely understood half of what he was saying. She laughed softly, but I loved listening because he loved talking. Her smile faded. Then the company grew, and suddenly there were suppliers, employees, trade shows, hunting expos, long weekends, late nights. He'd come home exhausted. I told myself it was temporary. She looked down. I've been telling myself that for 4 years. Nolan nodded thoughtfully. Did you ever tell him you missed those midnight conversations? I tried. What happened? He'd apologize, and then he'd say next month would be easier. She smiled sadly. Apparently, next month is a mythical place. Nolan couldn't help smiling. I've visited it many times. I've never managed to arrive. They shared a brief laugh. Then the quiet returned. Nolan turned his coffee cup slowly in his hand. May I offer you an observation? She nodded. Please. I don't think you've been describing anger. She frowned. I think you've been describing grief. She looked at him. There's a difference. When we're angry, we want someone to hear us. When we're grieving, we quietly begin expecting that they never will. His words settled heavily. I think you've been grieving your marriage for quite some time. She stared out across the prairie. I have. The admission escaped almost as a whisper. I think I have. A breeze drifted through the open driver's door. She closed her eyes for a moment. I stopped asking him how his day was. She opened them again. Not because I didn't care, because I already knew the answer. Busy, long, maybe tomorrow. She smiled without humor. It became easier to stop asking. Nolan nodded once. Resignation often disguises itself as peace. She looked across at him. What do you mean? We sometimes convince ourselves we've accepted something, when in reality, we've simply grown tired. She considered that. I am tired. I know. No, she shook her head. I don't think anyone does. She looked into the distance. I'm tired of wondering whether today's the day he'll notice me. I'm tired of pretending I don't count the hours until he comes home. I'm tired of rehearsing conversations in my head only to decide they aren't worth having. She laughed softly. You know what's embarrassing? What? I still straighten my hair on Fridays. He looked at her curiously. Why Fridays? Because Fridays used to be date night. A small crease pulled at the corner of her mouth. It hasn't actually been date night in almost 2 years. But she shrugged. Part of me still thinks maybe this Friday will be different. The words hung in the air. So every Friday, I straighten my hair. I wear the earrings he bought me. And then I cook dinner. She looked down. Most Fridays he eats in his office. The last sentence barely carried any sound. Nolan let the silence remain. After nearly a minute, he asked quietly, "Have you ever told him that?" "No." "Why not?" She smiled warily, because I don't want him to go out with me because he feels guilty. I want him to want to. She rubbed the edge of the coffee cup with her thumb. I don't miss restaurants. I miss being chosen. Nolan lowered his eyes. He understood exactly what she meant. People often believe love was measured in extraordinary sacrifices. Yet, the deepest longing was usually far simpler. To be thought of, to be looked for, to be missed, to know that someone else's day became brighter simply because you had entered it. He spoke carefully. May I ask you one final question? She nodded. When you walk through the front door tonight to Ethan, what do you hope happens? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the last strip of orange disappearing beneath the horizon. I hope. She dropped her gaze. I hope he notices I'm home. Her voice grew quieter. I hope he asks how my day was. I hope he remembers I had to drive all the way into town. I hope he thanks me for collecting his package. She looked back into the darkening sky. And if I'm being completely honest, a tear finally escaped despite her efforts to stop it. I hope he smiles at me the way he used to. She quickly wiped her cheek before another tear could follow. I don't need flowers. I don't need expensive trips. I don't even need an apology. She laughed gently through the emotion. I'd settle for 10 uninterrupted minutes. Nolan looked out across the prairie instead of at her, allowing her dignity, the privacy of not being watched while she cried. After a long silence, he said quietly, "I think many marriages fail long before love does." She turned toward him. They fail because two people slowly become witnesses to one another's lives instead of participants. He looked at the fading stars appearing overhead. "We're remarkably good at scheduling meetings, appointments, business trips, dentist visits, vet appointments." He smiled gently. "But we rarely schedule presents, and presents." He rested his coffee cup on the dashboard. "Is where intimacy has always lived." Neither of them spoke again for several minutes. Outside, night finally settled over the Wyoming prairie, wrapping the lonely road in quiet darkness. The broken down sedan no longer felt like an inconvenience. It had become, if only for one evening, a place where difficult truths could be spoken without interruption, and where silence itself seemed willing to listen. Nolan set his empty cup carefully in the holder between the seats. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with an almost absent-minded sigh, he stepped out the open door onto the gravel. The evening air had grown noticeably cooler. The last sliver of daylight had surrendered to dusk, leaving only a violet ribbon along the western horizon. The cottonwood whispered overhead as Nolan slowly circled to the front of the sedan. Tamber watched him through the windshield. He reached into his pocket. When his hand emerged, it held a worn packet of cigarettes. She blinked. For reasons she couldn't explain, it surprised her. He struck a lighter. The small flame briefly illuminated his face before disappearing beneath the glow of the cigarette. He inhaled once, not hurriedly, not with the desperate rhythm of addiction, rather with the practiced resignation of someone who knew the habit was an old companion he should have left behind years ago. He leaned lightly against the front fender. The ember glowed orange against the gathering darkness. Tamber smirked. I didn't expect that. He looked over the cigarette. She nodded. It doesn't seem to suit you. Really, she shook her head. I don't know. I pictured someone who quoted philosophy and spoke about preventative care, drinking tea. He laughed quietly. I disappoint you already. It's just, she searched for the words, doesn't match the man I've been talking to. He looked down at the cigarette. It doesn't. He smiled without humor. Some habits survive the versions of ourselves that created them. The wind carried away the smoke almost immediately. He looked toward the prairie for several moments before turning his attention back to her. His expression had changed, not hardened, simply become more deliberate. He met her eyes. Tell me about Trevor. Everything inside Tamber stopped. The warmth left her face so suddenly she felt it herself. Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. What? His voice remained gentle. Tell me about Trevor. She stared at him. The breeze seemed to disappear. Even the crickets felt suddenly distant. I'm sorry. Her voice had become almost a whisper. Would you repeat that? Tell me about Trevor. She slowly climbed out of the driver's seat. The gravel shifted beneath her boots. She searched his face as though seeing him for the first time. How? She swallowed. How do you know Trevor? He remained silent. Her breathing grew shallower. No. She took another step. Who are you? The question carried no anger, only confusion. Nolan held her gaze. Please. His tone was remarkably calm. Answer the question. She looked away. Her heartbeat seemed louder than the evening wind. Several long seconds passed. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded older somehow. Trevor. She closed her eyes. Is the veterinarian at the clinic? She looked toward the dark horizon. I've worked beside him for nearly 6 years. A sad smile crossed her face. He's one of those people animals trust immediately. I've never understood it. Nervous dogs settle around him. Fractious horses become calm. Even frightened children seem to breathe easier when he speaks. She wrapped her arms around herself. She hesitated. A genuinely good man. Nolan listened without interruption. When Ethan, she corrected herself. When my husband took my savings, I didn't tell anyone. Not for weeks. I was embarrassed. I kept wondering how someone could steal from the person they love and somehow convince that same person it wasn't really stealing. Her eyes drifted toward the gravel. One afternoon, I broke. There'd been a difficult surgery at the clinic. We'd lost an old Labrador. I'd managed to hold myself together all day. But after everyone left, she drew a heavy breath. I couldn't anymore. She looked down. Trevor found me sitting on the treatment room floor. I remember feeling ridiculous. I was 34 years old, crying beside a cabinet full of bandages. She shook her head. He didn't ask me to stop. He didn't tell me everything would be all right. He simply sat on the floor with me. The memory lingered in her eyes. And eventually, I told him. I told him about the money. I told him how frightened I was. I told him I didn't recognize my own marriage anymore. She stared at her hands. What happened next? She paused. Is something I've carried every day since. Her voice grew quieter. I was lonely. Not the kind of lonely that comes from being by yourself. The kind that comes from wondering whether the person who once knew your heart can still find it. A tear formed before she wiped it away. Trevor was kind. He listened. He never criticized Ethan. He never encouraged me to leave. He simply. She searched for the truth, made me feel seen. She lowered her head. For a little while, we crossed a line we never should have crossed. It didn't last. It wasn't planned. It wasn't some great romance. She shook her head. slowly. It was two people making a terrible decision, while one of them was trying to escape pain instead of facing it. She closed her eyes. I ended it as soon as I understood what I was doing. Her voice broke, but ending something doesn't erase that it happened. Silence settled between them. The cigarette had nearly burned to its filter. Nolan let it fall onto the gravel and carefully crushed it beneath his shoe. When Ethan found out, he stopped himself. When your husband found out, what happened? Tamber looked at him with hollow eyes. He didn't. The words barely carried. He doesn't know. She stared into the darkness. He still doesn't.